I'm sure you already know, but there is a very popular belief in the Dynasty community that if a rookie wide receiver does not hit 525 receiving yards in year one, historically speaking, they aren't going to make it. Historically speaking, they have no shot at becoming successful at the NFL level. And while this has a lot of truth to it, where if you look at historical data, wide receivers that are unable to hit 525 receiving yards in their first season really have an incredibly high bust rate through the rest of their NFL careers. However, it's not as simple as looking at that one number. It's not as simple as looking at that one statistic and trying to derive what a player's career is going to be like. You have to dive a little bit deeper in with these guys that especially we liked as prospects. I mean, you pull up this Reddit post real quick. Someone decided to take the time, look at all wide receivers that did not post 500 receiving yards in year one that ended up having multiple 1,000-yard receiving seasons in their NFL career. And obviously, this is a laundry list of players that were able to find success. So I want to dive into two players that I liked as prospects that had bad rookie seasons and try to come up with a reasonable expected hit rate and identify if they should be potential buy low candidates or if we should still just continue to avoid them in Dynasty. Now, our first guy is Quentin Johnston. And it is painful to admit, but I liked Quentin Johnston as a prospect. I mean, pretty much all the big boxes that we looked for, he checked. This is a wide receiver that broke out as a true freshman. At TCU, he goes out, he has 487 receiving yards in only 8 games played, which is good for about 61 receiving yards per game. But more impressively, with how bad this TCU offense was, this was a market share at 31%. This is an elite mark for an 18-year-old kid to go to a Big 12 offense and to be able to command a third of it. It's incredible. Then he goes, he dominates as a true sophomore. He takes a step up, averages almost 80 receiving yards per game, and has a market share number of about 33%. He declares as a true junior, which we've historically seen does improve your probability of hitting at the next level. And at the same time, he goes round 1 of the NFL draft to a team with a phenomenal franchise quarterback. So you go through these boxes. Yeah, he's great starting as a freshman. He's dominant as a sophomore. He declares as a true junior. He goes round 1 of the NFL draft. So a team's film department is willing to sign off that he does have the talent on the field to make an impact at the next level. And he turns out to be absolutely nothing. And we're sitting here with egg on our faces, trying to scramble, trying to figure out what exactly went wrong. Before we look at what we should expect going forward, let's outline Jackson Smith-Njigba, because this was my number 1 wide receiver in last year's class. I loved JSN, and we are pretty much basing everything off of one single season, right? Because with JSN, you have a very limited sample in which we can look at, in that his first year at Ohio State, as a true freshman, you're not doing anything as a wide receiver. I mean, we've even seen Marvin Harrison Jr. not be able to do anything as a true freshman receiver at Ohio State. But as a true sophomore, he goes out and posts 1,600 receiving yards. 1,600 receiving yards in 13 games played. He leads this team in receiving by a wide margin. If we're going to be comparing him to other wide receivers in the same offense, JSN was at 1,600. Garrett Wilson was at 1,000. Chris Olave was at 900. Emeka Egbuka was at 191. Marvin Harrison Jr. 139. Now, of course, those last two guys, they were freshmen. JSN was a sophomore, but Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, they were juniors, and JSN was more productive in the same offense. So you see that. You see the fact that this is a wide receiver that also goes round 1 in the NFL draft, and I'm sold, okay? I'm willing to go in on him in Dynasty. And then you see what happens their respective rookie seasons. Starting off with Quentin Johnston, this was arguably one of the worst rookie wide receiver seasons you could ever have, because Mike Williams goes down right at the beginning of the season, where Mike Williams only plays 3 games. Austin Eckler goes down at the beginning of the year as well, where he misses a stretch of time. And you have to consider the fact that Eckler obviously is a massive role as a receiver in this offense. And with no Austin Eckler, you should expect going forward, oh, okay, well, I guess that means you have 2 of the top receiving options out. Quentin Johnston is all of a sudden going to actually have a chance and actually break. Nope, that's not what happens in the slightest. Quentin Johnston comes out and he averages a whopping 25 receiving yards per game with Other top options in this offense going down. This is including Keenan Allen missing 4 games. This is including Joshua Palmer missing 6 games. Everybody in this offense but Quentin Johnston misses time, gets hurt, and Johnston cannot do anything with the opportunities. You have Erickson averaging more receiving yards per game. Gerald Everett averages more receiving yards per game than Quentin Johnston. And if you pull up flockfantasy.com real quick, just get a sense of exactly where he's valued now. He's at 135 in the expert rankings, 147 when it comes to the community rankings. Like, let me go and pull up what you'd be looking at in terms of his community ranking value in comparison to a rookie pick. So if you were to buy or sell Quentin Johnston, what price point are you doing so with? And according to the flockfantasy.com community rankings, he is now worth in the same range as a late 2024 second / a 2024 third. He's worth more than a third. You're not going to be able to buy him at that price, but he's probably worth less than a second. Go out there and try to sell him for the 206. It's probably not happening. So that gives you a baseline of understanding the Dynasty community wants nothing to do with the guy, and it's understandable. And of course, if you wanted to check out those rankings on flockfantasy.com, the community rankings completely free. Head over to the site whenever you want. You don't even need an account. Obviously, you have our expert rankings from myself, everybody else you watch on YouTube over there as well. Those will be behind a paywall. And if you wanted to check those out, or if you wanted to get access to our Dynasty trade calculator, if you wanted yours truly to break down your Dynasty fantasy football team in a podcast, all that can be found over there on flockfantasy.com. Code FLOCK will get you 30% off any subscription, plus yours truly breaking down your Dynasty fantasy football team in a podcast. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to pull up the RotoViz screener and not just look at, oh, he had less than 525 receiving yards. What does this mean? No, we wanted to dive in deep and look at Quentin Johnston, who averaged 2.2 receptions per game, 3.8 targets per game, 25 receiving yards per game, and 5.6 fantasy points per game. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to say, what if things worked out a little bit better? Maybe he just got unlucky with a couple drops, right? So I went to the RotoViz screener. I looked at all rookie wide receiver seasons since the year 2000, where the wide receivers averaged less than 3.2 receptions, which is a full reception per game more than Quentin, 4.8 targets per game, which is a full target per game more than him, 35 receiving yards per game, which is an additional 10 receiving yards per game, and fewer than 6.6 fantasy points, which is an additional extra fantasy point per game. So we're juicing his stats here, ladies and gentlemen. And there were 194 rookie wide receivers to have a season this bad out of 846 rookies since the year 2000. And if we are looking at the following season, so year 2 for these guys, how many of them turned into wide receiver ones in fantasy? That's averaging about 16.4 points per game. That was at least the wide receiver 1 threshold for this past season. There was one guy out of the 194, and that was Brandon Marshall. So you're looking at an expected hit rate of 0.51%. That's about 1 out of 200. Now, I know you're going to say, well, Mace, I don't need him to be a wide receiver 1 next year. I just need him to do anything, right? You just need to be a wide receiver 2. Well, if we're going to look at wide receiver 2s, the threshold there is going to be 13.7 points per game. How many of the 194 hit 13.7 points per game the following season? You had 6. That's good for about 3.09%. So 3 out of 100, essentially, guys are going to become at least wide receiver 2s. The list here is going to be Cecil Shorts, Nate Burleson, DJ Chark, Michael Gallup, Randall Cobb, and Brandon Marshall. So the expected hit rate for Quentin Johnston at this point is zilch. It's nothing. Now, I know you're going to say, well, Mason, a lot of these guys weren't first-round picks. We'll look at first-round picks in just one second because that does change things just a bit. But just to check in on a Mr. Jackson Smith-Njigba, who in his own right, put up a very disappointing rookie season. I was extremely excited. I really liked him as a prospect. JSN goes out there. He averages only about 36.9 receiving yards per game. He does have 4 receiving touchdowns. He plays all 17 weeks. But I do want to make sure that there is a clear distinction. Jackson Smith-Njigba's season was much better than Quentin Johnston's. Johnston failed with no competition, with elite quarterback play, whereas JSN was injured going into the season. He had to play alongside DK Metcalf. he had to play alongside Tyler Lockett, both of whom played at least 16 games. And instead of having Justin Herbert, you were stuck with Geno Smith. So I do want to at least clarify for everybody. I understand, yes, JSN was much better than Quentin. And we are going to juice his statistics just like we did with Quentin Johnston. So instead of looking at all wide receivers who had fewer than 3.8 receptions per game, 5.5 targets, 38 receiving yards, and 9.1 fantasy points, instead, we're going to be looking at 4.8, 6.5, 48, and 10.1. So we're going to be moving that threshold up better than what JSN did as a rookie. And here you are looking at 301 rookie wide receivers that put up a similar season or a worse season than those juice numbers. And if we are going through the same test that we did with Quentin Johnston, out of these 301, there were 2 players to post a wide receiver 1 season the following year. Those 2 guys were Alshon Jeffrey and Brandon Marshall. But if you're looking at that expected hit rate, that's 0.66%. That's less than 1%. Now, obviously, you can get away with him being a wide receiver 2. And here, you're going to have significantly more wide receivers. You have 17 out of 301 wide receivers the following season posting up a top 24. I mean, you have guys like Alshon Jeffrey, Brandon Marshall, Kenny Britt, Randall Cobb, Mike Wallace, Michael Gallup, Alan Hurns, DJ Chark, Deontay Johnson, blah, 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 blah. You had 17 guys. But nonetheless, that is an expected hit rate of about 5.5% to be a wide receiver 2 this next season. Those are horribly bad numbers, and 100% it is faulty just to stop there, because you have to consider that a lot of these rookie wide receivers that we are evaluating in this model, they were drafted in round 7. They were drafted in round 6. They were drafted in round 5, right? They don't have nearly the pedigree that you're getting with Quentin Johnston or Jackson Smith-Njigba. So let's move on beyond this. Let's just put one more filter in, and let's get rid of all those guys that were drafted at the end of the draft. Let's get rid of the guys that were drafted in the middle rounds. Let's only look at the guys that had a lot of pedigree coming in. Let's only look at the round 1 wide receivers. So we filter it down to the round 1 wide receivers for Quentin Johnston that had those juiced numbers better than Johnston did. 3.2 receptions, 4.8 targets, 35 yards, and 6.6 fantasy points. There were 27 wide receivers to put up a season that was worse than those juiced numbers. The following year, how many of those guys were able to post a top 12 season, aka 16.4 fantasy points per game? 0 out of 27. What about a wide receiver 2 season, right? I mean, these are the guys with the pedigree that just completely face planted and did absolutely nothing in year 1. 0. The guys at the very top of the list did go on to have, respectable careers. Mike Williams was never a league winner, but at one point he had fantasy value, right? Even if the points didn't follow, he was respected in the community. Demaryius Thomas, obviously at one point of his NFL career, did manage to turn into a league winner, but nonetheless, if you were holding the bags early on in his career, you weren't really reaping any rewards. Obviously, this is a different trajectory, and you can't necessarily chase an outlier. I want to reiterate, 0 guys out of the 27 that posted a season similar to Quentin Johnston with juiced numbers turned around to be wide receiver 2s. And I would make the argument that Johnston had no excuse to fail this miserably in year 1. Now, JSN, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit different. If you look at his juice numbers of 4.8 receptions per game, 6.5 targets, 48 receiving yards, and 10.1 fantasy points, there were more round 1 wide receivers that hit this threshold. You're looking at a sample size of 47 that finished this poorly compared to his juice numbers, of course. And out of those guys, 0 turned out to be wide receiver 1s the following season. Now, going over to the wide receiver 2 threshold, you did have 3 players manage to do it. Kenny Britt, one of those guys, right? So historically speaking, that's about a 6.38% expected hit rate for Jackson Smith-Njigba to be a top 24 wide receiver this next season. Now, I'm not going to stop here, and I'm not going to say, oh, okay, well, that means JSN is undraftable, JSN's uninvestable, sell JSN. So no, I'm not going to do that at all. But I do want to revisit where I personally have these wide receivers ranked on flogfantasy.com. The video that we recently put out where I did not have Jackson Smith-Njigba before the cutoff when that video ended and the comment section and exploring what kind of value you could possibly expect for JSN at this moment. So let me go ahead. Let me pull up this video because people were pissed with me. I mean, they were not happy to say the least of how we ranked our top 30, quote unquote. Keep in mind, we included rookie picks, those less than 30 wide receivers in Dynasty. My last tier included players like the Houston wide receivers, T. Higgins, Drake London, DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, Zay Flowers. That was essentially our last tier of wide receivers that we had here. And the number one statement that people came out and had was, well, Mason, where the hell is Jackson Smith-Njigba? JSN should be on this. My question to you is, who are you ranking JSN over? I cannot take Jackson Smith-Njigba over Nico Collins. I can't take him over Tank Dell. And then side note, we need to move up to Houston wide receivers now that we look at this. I can't take him over T. Higgins. I can't take him over Drake London. I'm not taking him over DJ Moore. I'm not taking him over Deebo Samuel. I'm not taking him over Zay Flowers. And I'm not taking him over the rookie pick 107. If you could trade JSN for the 107, hit the reset button and either draft Rome or Bowers in a super flex league, that is going to be something I do. Now, of course, one quarterback format, completely different range of the draft. One quarterback format, you are not making that move. But super flex, give me the 107 over JSN. Now, when it comes to Quentin Johnston, you're looking at a much worse player that did not have the excuses that JSN did, because JSN, I think, could be much better this next season, given the fact that Lockett may be on the way out. But Quentin Johnston, I would sell for obviously any first round pick. That's easy. One quarterback or a super flex. Sell him if you can get the 112. I don't care. If it's a super flex league, I'd be willing to sell JSN for an early second. If it was a super flex league, I'd probably have him right around a mid-second round pick. And depending on who's on the board, honestly, I think you make an argument maybe to hit the reset button with someone like Xavier Worthy over Quentin Johnston at this point, based off what you saw his rookie season. But let me remind y'all, I am not saying just based off these numbers that JSN only has a 6% chance of hitting. I do think it's a lot higher than that. I think his situation was unique in year one, but we are setting the baseline expectation for what the numbers say. And then from that baseline, we are putting context to it and trying to come up with a more accurate number in our own mind. So if the baseline expectation for JSN to be a top 24 wide receiver this next season, based off his juice numbers, is about 6.5%. But then we take into account, okay, you had to compete with Metcalf, you had to compete with Lockett. Maybe that's different going forward. What are we boosting it to? Are we doubling it? Are we tripling it? Are we quadrupling it? Are we 5Xing it? Like, at what point does it become unreasonable? You know? So I'd say the expected hit rate is going to be, at least in my mind, after you make your own adjustments based off what you think of his situation in his context. I'm still having it behind Tank Dell. I'm still having it behind T. Higgins. I'm still having it behind Drake London and all those wide receivers in the last tier. And I'm definitely having it behind someone like Rome, someone like Neighbors, or obviously Marvin Harrison Jr. this year. But I think that's all I have for y'all. I don't want to come across as a massive hater. I love these guys as prospects. I just want to be realistic. When you have a very bad rookie season, it's not something that we can just flat out ignore, even though we can, of course, put context to it. But I think that's all I have for you. Really appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. If you want to get our updated Dynasty Fantasy Football rankings, which I will update before this video comes out because Nico Collins definitely needs to rise. If you want to check out our Dynasty Trade Calculator that you can put in your exact league settings, so it's going to be the most accurate trade calculator you can find. Or if you want to get your roster broken down in a podcast by yours truly, find all that on flockfantasy.com. Promo code FLOCK, get you 30% off any subscription, plus a free week trial, and yours truly breaking down your Dynasty Fantasy Football team in a podcast. But I think that's all I have for you. Really do appreciate you and really hope we get to actually see you out with a live stream, I believe, on Saturday.